In April 1974, the county of Cumberland was one of two counties in the far northwest of England that quite literally disappeared off the face of the map. But what happened exactly, and what of its legacy today? Well, in short, it's more alive than you might think, as I'll explain. This is the story of a county renowned for its deep history and jaw-dropping natural beauty, a county famed for its castles, mountains, lakes, daffodils, and one of the world's most valuable inventions, of which there may well be one within arm's reach of you right now. So join me for a tour of one of England's quote-unquote lost counties as we celebrate all things Cumberland. Where do we begin? Well, as it happens, almost every town in Cumberland has its own unique piece of the puzzle, contributing to its story as a whole. So let's have a look at them in sequence in rough chronological order. Around 2,000 years ago, the Carvetii tribe are believed to have centred their territory around what is today the city of Carlisle. By the late 1st century AD, the Romans had begun to set their sights on what equates in modern terms as the north of England. In typical fashion, they displaced the Carvetii, established a fort here, and gave it a Latinised version of a Brittonic name, in this case, Lugavalium. This new territory in what had become the northern frontier of the Roman Empire was one in which defence was prioritised, leading to the construction of Hadrian's Wall in the 2nd century. Spanning the entire mainland from east to west, a series of nearby forts were built for the purpose of maintaining the wall. One such fort arose about 25 miles to the southwest. The Romans gave it the Brittonic-derived name Alorna, which we today refer to as Maryport. This fort had a dual role. Firstly, as a garrison to soldiers within marching distance of the wall's westernmost point, bonus on Solway in modern terms, and secondly, as part of a broader coastal defence system guarding the Solway Firth which feeds into the Irish Sea. A lack of accounts of any major incursions onto this coastline during this era would imply that said defences were effective. However, a shocking invasion would take place on this same stretch of coast just over 10 miles away a mere 2.5 centuries ago, in a tale of betrayal which stunned the entire country, as I'll explain in due course. But first, there is another Cumberland town lying in the vicinity of Hadrian's Wall, and that is Brampton. Just east of Carlisle and a couple of miles south of the wall, this provides a nice backdrop in which to explain the fall of Rome and what came next. The empire withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, leaving a void which would later be filled by the Anglo-Saxons. The kingdom of Northumbria, formed in the 7th century, would come to control our subject matter, the area which became known as Cumberland. Things got a little complex following the invasion of the Great Heathen Army in the 9th century, but the short version is the Celtic kingdom of Strathclyde asserted dominance here, although fragments of Viking activity are implied in certain place names, such as Bassenthwaite, Threlkeld, Thursby, and a major town we'll shortly visit. The very origin of the name Cumberland is itself a Brittonic word for compatriots, in common with the native name for Wales, Cymru. As well as a certain town with a name so Brittonic it could almost be mistaken for somewhere in the heart of Wales, Penrith, meaning ford by the hill, helpfully illustrates the nuances in place names in this historic county, and with it the political turmoil of the Anglo-Saxon era at the heart of it all. And then came the Normans. And it was one Norman in particular who played a vital role at the very core of the county. At the time of the conquest, Carlisle was in possession of the Scots. That was until 1092, when King William II, son of William the Conqueror, brought an army north and secured it for the English, building Carlisle Castle in order to assert control. But the Normans didn't stop there. Likely wary of the Scots, they built several castles in the broader area, including one town with a particularly Norman name, Egremont. The town, lying around 40 miles southwest of Carlisle, was once owned by a string of Norman noblemen who were likely responsible for its name, meaning pointed hill in Old French. The castle dates from the early 12th century. Even in its ruined state of today, its imposing position overlooking many miles is still evident. When Henry III granted a market charter to the town in 1266, including the rights to an annual fair, a wonderfully eccentric tradition was born the following year, namely the Egremont Crab Fair. The name is believed to come from a tradition where the Lord of Egremont would give away crab apples to the townsfolk, which continues to this day in the form of the Parade of the Apple Cart. Other events that take place include wrestling, greasy pole climbing, egg throwing, and of course its crowning glory, the World Gurning Championships, where competitors stick their head through a horse collar and pull the most contorted face they can manage. As to the question you're probably asking right now, my answer is simply, why not? One of the sport's biggest legends is the late Anne Woods, who won the women's event a record-breaking 28 times. Aside from annual fairs though, medieval Cumberland was a turbulent time and place, mainly on account of the wars of Scottish independence. The Tudor era that followed brought an upgrade to Carlisle's defences. The citadel, whose construction was ordered by Henry VIII himself, features two round towers designed to withstand the new threat of artillery fire. With a little help from some Regency-era restoration, these remain standing as a grand first impression to the city for those arriving by train to this day. The Tudor era also brought about one of the most important discoveries to mankind, even if we do take it for granted, and it all came about via a former mining town with an Old Norse name, Keswick. It was among the surrounding landscape that a substance going by the nickname black lead was found, and initially used to mark sheep. Today, we know it as graphite. A cottage industry emerged here involving encasing the substance with sticks as an early form of the pencil, which would later develop into a factory-driven operation spearheaded by the Cumberland Pencil Company, founded here in 1832. The town would later become one of the leading tourist hotspots in the country for reasons completely unrelated to stationery, which I'll explain shortly. But before Keswick had made its mark on the world, so to speak, another mining town was rapidly developing into what would become at its peak, believe it or not, Britain's second busiest port, Whitehaven. During the 17th century, this underwent a transformation from a tiny fishing village into a planned settlement said to be 3 times the size of Carlisle. The broader plan was to utilise its combination of a coastal location and nearby coalfields, a big deal in the era prior to the arrival of the canals. Daniel Defoe remarked in the 1720s that Whitehaven had, quote, grown up from a small place to be very considerable by the coal trade, which has increased so considerably of late that it is now the most eminent port in England for shipping off coals, except Newcastle and Sunderland, and even beyond the last, unquote. But a real-life story of betrayal would hit Whitehaven in such a manner that Defoe himself could never have penned. It centred around the actions of an 18th century naval officer by the name John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones. Born in Cumbria in southern Scotland in 1747, John Paul began his naval apprenticeship right here in Whitehaven, making his familiarity with the Solway Firth twofold, which will soon become significant. Plagued by legal troubles following the death of one of his sailors at his own hand, John Paul would later defect and join the Continental Navy, precursor to the US Navy, in 1775. Then, in 1778, during the American Revolutionary War, John Paul Jones did the unthinkable. He attacked the very town that had served him as an apprentice, Whitehaven. The damage incurred by the raid included the spiking, or disabling, of 36 cannons and the burning of 1 to 3 ships. The raid hit a snag when the crew went into town to look for more fuel to start fires, but apparently got sidetracked and stopped for a drink or two down the pub, as you do. This traitorous act from the reverse Benedict Arnold, as it were, actually gave the British an important wake-up call as to the state of its coastal defences, just in time for the Napoleonic Wars, and it was these wars that made travel to continental Europe ill-advised during this period, so the Georgian high society began looking closer to home for potential travel destinations. Fortunately, inspiration was on hand by way of Cockermouth, which in 1770 became the birthplace of William Wordsworth. After studying at the University of Cambridge and subsequently touring Europe prior to the time things had started to kick off, Wordsworth returned to the broad region of his birth by way of the neighbouring county of Westmorland, the common thread being the landscape which, through his influence, would come to be known as the Lake District. In the early 19th century, Wordsworth penned the immortal words, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of dancing daffodils." Later revised to golden daffodils, and it is said flowers that have since become an icon of the very town of his birth. Although Cockermouth itself lies on the fringe of the Lake District, the neighbouring town of Keswick is situated at its very heart, and it was here that Wordsworth resided for a few years with fellow poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. These two, among others, including Robert Southey, became known collectively as the Lake Poets. Their romantic verses trickled down into culture, leading to an influx of tourists willing to brave the long stagecoach journey into these enchanting lands of mountains and lakes. Save for the addition of trains and cars, nothing much has changed in that regard to this day. Mountaineers are drawn to the likes of Skiddaw, Helvellyn, and of course England's tallest, Scafell Pike. As lakes go, Cumberland has to its name, among others, Bassenthwaite Lake, Derwentwater, and Ullswater, the latter being the inspiration for Wordsworth's aforementioned poem, by the way. In May of 1951, the Lake District became a national park, making its peaks freely accessible to all, and newcomers could learn all about the area in advance, thanks to Alfred Wainwright, who between the 1950s and 60s wrote a 7-part series of books titled A Pictorial Guide to the Lakeland Fells, helping to put Cumberland and neighbouring Westmorland firmly on the map. Shortly before they were taken off the map, kind of, but more on that later. The Victorian era saw Cumberland go from strength to strength as an industrial county. This was especially the case in the town of Workington. In common with its neighbours Maryport and Whitehaven, seen earlier, Workington grew as a coal mining town, but it was an adjacent industry for which it became known: steel. After Henry Bessemer developed the Bessemer process in 1856, whereby pig iron was converted to steel by blasting hot air through a large container to remove impurities, demand for Cumberland pig iron skyrocketed. At its peak in the late 19th century, Workington was the centre for steel production in northwest England. Although both the coal and steel industries have long since dwindled, Workington still boasts a functioning port handling about 500,000 tonnes of cargo annually, a small amount on a national scale granted, but larger than all other ports of Cumberland put together, which includes the aforementioned Maryport and Whitehaven, as well as another town with an unusual backstory, Silloth. For most of its history, this was a mere coastal hamlet. This all changed from around the 1850s following the silting up of the Solway in the village of Port Carlisle. This necessitated the creation of a new port just downstream. The resulting settlement consists of a grid of houses constructed for workers at the port and the connecting railway, but in true Victorian fashion it doubled up as a seaside resort. I use the term seaside loosely, of course, but I'm sure we can take a second or two to appreciate these views. After all, from where else in England can you see Scotland on the horizon, and as clearly as this? But the real question is, of course, the premise of this entire video: what happened to Cumberland, and why, for that matter? Well, the short answer is, in a word, Cumbria. This is the ceremonial county of the area today, which came about on the 1st of April 1974 as the merger of Cumberland and Westmorland, along with the Furness and Cartmel peninsulas, which historically formed an exclave of Lancashire, and a small portion of the West Riding of Yorkshire, which somehow got roped in as well. The aim appears to have been to simplify local government into a new entity centred around the Lake District for reasons of cohesion relating to the tourism economy. The low populations of both Cumberland and Westmorland, which combined came to under 500,000 at the 1971 census, were considered manageable under a single county council. But there's a twist in the tale. Cumbria County Council split into two unitary authorities in 2023, namely Cumberland Council and Westmorland and Furness Council. Assumptions could be made regarding the role of population growth, but the 2021 census still has the population of Cumbria as almost exactly 500,000, in other words, about the same as 50 years earlier, in contrast with the metropolitan counties. So its reversion to separate local governments seems, if anything, like backpedaling, as well as an acknowledgement that the respective histories of Cumberland and Westmorland count for something bigger than just marketing the area as a tourist destination, although retaining Cumbria as a ceremonial county seems like a cunning workaround whereby they can have it both ways. And last but by no means least, what then of Westmorland? Because 100% of the footage featured in this video is from Cumberland, hence no mention of Windermere, Ambleside, Kendal, Appleby and Kirkby Lonsdale, just to name a few. Should I produce a sequel to this video examining the equally stunning historic county of Westmorland? If so, by all means pop this video a like in the interest of feedback, but for now we close out on one of Cumberland's most celebrated views, Fry's Crag over Derwent Water. Thanks for watching and have a great day.